The plane was cruising at 22,000 feet when the wing hit the mountain. There was no warning. 1 second, the passengers were laughing, joking about the rugby match they were flying to play. The next, the fuselage was tearing itself apart against solid rock, and the world became a screaming blur of metal and snow. Nando Pardew was 22 years old. He'd boarded that plane with his mother and his younger sister, thinking about nothing more than a weekend of rugby in Chile. He had no idea he was about to become one of the most extraordinary survival stories the world has ever heard. He had no idea he'd spend the next 10 weeks fighting things no young man should ever have to fight, things that would break most people completely. But here's what makes this story different from every other survival tale you've heard. Nando didn't just survive. He walked out of the mountains that tried to kill him, and then he walked back in to save the ones who couldn't walk out themselves. This is the story of the Andes crash. And by the end of it, you'll understand why 16 men are alive today, because one grieving, frostbitten young man refused to let the mountains win. It was October 13th, 1972. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 was carrying the Old Christians Club rugby team, along with family and friends, over the Andes Mountains towards Santiago, Chile. The weather was rough. Clouds pressed in against the peaks, and the pilots, trying to navigate through the narrow mountain corridor, misjudged their position. They thought they'd already cleared the mountain range. They hadn't. The plane dropped into what pilots call a sucker hole, a gap in the clouds that looks like clear sky but hides a wall of rock behind it. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late to climb. The right wing clipped the mountainside first. It tore off completely, spinning away into the white nothing below. Then the left wing went. Now he had lost his brother and his sister. The same opposing thousands of feet up a mountain that no one even knew they were on. Because that was the other horrifying truth settling over the survivors. Nobody was coming. The search parties had been looking initially. Planes flew over the general area where Flight 571 was thought to have gone down. But the fuselage, white and covered in snow, blended perfectly into the landscape below. After 8 days of fruitless searching, the Uruguayan authorities called off the search entirely. The survivors didn't know this at first. They held on to hope, listening to a small transistor radio they'd salvaged from the wreckage, waiting for news of rescue. And then, one evening, they heard it. A newscaster's voice confirming that the search had been called off, that they'd been given up for dead. Picture that moment. 27 people, injured, freezing, grieving, crammed into the broken shell of an airplane, hearing confirmation that the entire world believed they were already dead, that no one was coming to look for them anymore. Some of them cried. Some of them screamed. But something else happened too, something that would define the rest of this story. In that moment of complete abandonment, 8 more people died in that avalanche. 8 more names added to a death toll that kept climbing as the days dragged on. The survivors, already at their breaking point, now had to dig their dead teammates out of the snow with their bare hands, all while a storm raged outside that trapped them inside the buried fuselage for 3 more days. 3 days, sealed inside a metal tube under snow, unable to leave, breathing recycled air, listening to the wind howl outside like something alive and furious. By the time the storm cleared, the survivors who remained understood something with total clarity. Waiting for rescue was a fantasy. Nobody was coming. If they wanted to live, they had to save themselves. And that's where Nando Pardew stepped forward. Something had shifted in him after losing his mother and his sister. Grief had hollowed him out, but it had also forged something unbreakable. He decided he would walk out of the mountains, no matter what it took, no matter the odds. He'd rather die trying to reach civilization than die waiting in that frozen tomb for a rescue that would never come. He wasn't alone in this resolve. Roberto Canessa, a medical student, and Antonio Vizinin joined him. Together, the 3 of them began preparing for what would become one of the most legendary treks in survival history. They had no proper equipment, no climbing boots, no ropes, no cold weather gear built for the brutal conditions of the Andes. So they improvised. They used seat cushions from the plane as makeshift sleeping bags, stuffing them with insulation ripped from the fuselage. They fashioned crude sunglasses from tinted plastic to protect against snow blindness. They packed what little food they could, frozen strips of flesh wrapped carefully, knowing it would need to sustain them for a journey with no clear endpoint. They had no map, no compass beyond guesswork. All they knew was that Chile lay to the west, and civilization lay somewhere beyond the endless walls of white and gray that surrounded them. On December 12th, 61 days after the crash, Nando, Roberto, and Antonio set out from the wreckage and began to climb. The mountain they faced first was one none of them had names for. It simply rose in front of them, a sheer wall of ice and rock, disappearing into clouds far above. They climbed anyway, one exhausted step at a time, lungs burning in air so thin it felt like breathing through a straw. Nando pushed himself with a kind of desperate fury. Every step forward was a step away from the place where his mother and sister had died. Every step forward was, in his mind, a step toward honoring their memory by refusing to give up. It took them days just to summit that first peak. When they finally reached the top, gasping, half-frozen, muscles screaming in protest, they looked out at the view they'd been dreaming of for weeks. And what they saw broke something inside them. More mountains, endless, in every direction. No sign of green valleys, no roads, no rivers, nothing but an infinite ocean of white peaks stretching to the horizon as far as the eye could see. They had believed, based on flawed information from the pilots before the crash, that they were close to the Chilean border, close to civilization. The truth was devastating. They were deep in the heart of the Andes, hundreds of miles from anywhere. For a moment, it must have felt like the end, like all their effort, all their suffering had led only to the confirmation that survival was impossible. But Nando didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He'd made a promise to himself, standing at his sister's grave in the snow, that he would get out or die trying. There was no version of this story where he simply gave up and turned back. Antonio Vizintin, recognizing that 3 men wouldn't have enough food to make the full journey, made the selfless decision to turn back to the fuselage, leaving his portion of supplies with Nando and Roberto, so the 2 of them would have a better chance of making it the rest of the way. That left just Nando and Roberto, 2 exhausted, starving young men, walking across a landscape that seemed designed to kill them, with nothing but sheer will keeping them upright. They walked for days. Their bodies were wasting away, muscle and fat long since burned through by the cold and the exertion. Their feet were destroyed inside boots that had never been designed for mountaineering. Every night, they'd wrap themselves in their makeshift sleeping bag, shivering, praying for the strength to keep moving in the morning. And then, after 10 days of walking, something changed. They came across a valley. Not another endless expanse of snow and rock, but green. Actual green, grass and vegetation, a river running through it, evidence that they had finally descended below the snow line. Nando has described this moment as one of the most emotional of his entire life. After weeks of nothing but white and gray and death, the sight of green grass felt like proof that the world still existed, that life still existed, that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. They followed the river, knowing that rivers lead to civilization, that people build their lives near water. And on the 10th day of their trek, they spotted something on the opposite bank that made their hearts nearly stop. A man, a real, living human being, sitting on a horse, watching cattle graze. Nando and Roberto screamed and waved, but the roar of the river between them swallowed their voices. The man on the horse either didn't hear them or couldn't understand what he was seeing. 2 skeletal, filthy figures shouting from across the water, and he began to ride away. Desperate, refusing to let this chance slip through his fingers, Nando found a rock and wrote a message on it, using the only tool he had. He threw it across the river, again and again, until finally it landed close enough for the herder to notice. The message was simple. It said that they had come from a plane that had crashed in the mountains, that they were starving, that people were still alive back in the wreckage, and that they needed help immediately. The herder, a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan, understood instantly what he was looking at. He rode for hours to reach the nearest town with a telephone, and from there, set in motion the wheels of a rescue operation that the world thought had ended 2 months earlier. Word spread fast. The Andes survivors, the passengers of Flight 571, believed dead for over 2 months, were alive. Helicopters were dispatched to the coordinates Nando and Roberto provided from memory, but the terrain made it nearly impossible to reach the fuselage directly. It took Nando himself, still recovering from his own trek, guiding rescue teams by helicopter back toward the crash site, pointing out landmarks from the air that he remembered from his 10-day journey. On December 22nd and 23rd, the remaining survivors were finally airlifted out of the mountains, 72 days after the crash. 16 people walked away from that wreckage alive. 16 people who, without Nando Pareto's refusal to accept death as the final answer, might have simply faded away in that frozen graveyard, forgotten by a world that had already given up on them. When the survivors finally reached civilization, the story that emerged stunned the world. Not just the crash, not just the avalanche, but the unimaginable decision they'd made to survive and the impossible trek across the Andes that had saved them all. Nando Pardo didn't just survive an ordeal that should have killed him a dozen times over. He carried the weight of losing his mother and sister, and instead of letting that grief destroy him, he transformed it into the fuel that pushed him across mountains no one believed could be crossed on foot, with no equipment, no training, and no map. He went on to build a life defined by that experience. He became a public speaker, sharing his story with audiences around the world, not to shock them, but to remind them of what human beings are truly capable of when everything else has been stripped away. He wrote a memoir, Miracle in the Andes, giving readers an unflinching, deeply personal account of those 72 days. And decades later, when he's asked how he found the strength to keep walking when logic said it was hopeless, his answer is always some version of the same thing. He wasn't walking toward hope. He was walking toward his father, who he knew was waiting back home, still believing his family might somehow be alive. Every step Nando took across those mountains was a promise to a man who had already lost a wife and a daughter, and didn't yet know it. That's the piece of this story that so often gets lost beneath the shock of the survival cannibalism, beneath the drama of the avalanche and the crash itself. At its core, this is a story about what love can push a person to endure, what a son will do to spare his father even more grief than he's already carrying. Nando Pardo climbed mountains that experienced climbers wouldn't attempt without proper gear and years of training. He did it in tennis shoes and a makeshift sleeping bag, running on nothing but frozen scraps of food and sheer determination, because somewhere in his mind, the thought of his father waiting at home, still hoping, was more powerful than the mountain trying to kill him. If you made it this far, you already understand why this story has stayed with people for over 50 years. It's not just a tale of survival against impossible odds. It's a reminder of what's buried inside all of us, a strength we never know we have until the world leaves us with no other choice but to find it. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, do us a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what part of Nando's journey hit you hardest, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next incredible true story we bring you.